The president of Burkina Faso was crawling through garbage in the dead of night. His designer suit traded for rags that reeked of sweat and despair. Ibrahim Traoré, the man who commanded armies and shaped nations, now shuffled through the darkness with a wooden cane, his back bent like a question mark against the starless sky. He had made himself invisible to find the truth that power could never reveal. It had started 3 weeks earlier in his pristine office, where complaints about the provincial hospital in Bobo Dioulasso piled higher than hope. Citizens wrote of nurses demanding bribes, doctors who vanished when poverty walked through the door, and medicines that mysteriously disappeared before reaching those who needed them most. Each letter felt like a knife in Traoré's chest. He had promised his people dignity in healthcare, yet here was evidence that his vision had been betrayed by those entrusted to fulfill it. His advisors suggested investigations, committees, official inquiries. But Traoré knew such measures would only scatter the guilty like roaches fleeing light. No, he needed to see with the eyes of the forgotten, feel with the nerves of the abandoned. He would become what he once was, a man without power, without voice, without privilege. The transformation took patience. His barber aged him with gray powder and careful cuts that made his hair sparse and unkempt. Makeup artists painted shadows under his eyes, yellowed his teeth, added liver spots to his hands. They dressed him in clothes pulled from donation bins, a faded brown shirt with sweat stains, torn khaki pants held by fraying rope, plastic sandals with soles worn paper thin. When they handed him the wooden cane, carved rough and splintered, he felt the weight of every citizen who had ever limped toward help and found only closed doors. The 14-mile journey from the capital to Bobo Dioulasso stretched like a lifetime. Traoré rode hidden in the back of a produce truck, surrounded by crates of overripe mangoes and wilting cassava leaves. The smell made him nauseous, but he embraced it. This was the perfume of his people's daily struggle. As the truck rumbled over potholes, his bones rattled against wooden planks, each bump a reminder of the infrastructure he had yet to fix. He arrived at St. Catherine Provincial Hospital just past midnight, when exhaustion would make the staff less observant. The building slouched against the sky like a wounded giant, its concrete walls stained with rust and neglect. Fluorescent lights flickered through dirty windows, creating a Morse code of institutional failure. Traoré felt his anger rise, but pushed it down. Anger was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. At the emergency entrance, he hunched lower, letting his cane scrape against the cracked pavement. "Please," he wheezed to the security guard. "My stomach! The pain won't stop." The guard barely glanced up from his phone, waving him toward the registration desk with the casual cruelty of routine indifference. Inside, the smell hit him like a physical blow, disinfectant losing its battle against human misery. Sweat, urine, and something else he couldn't name but recognized as hopelessness. Patients lay on plastic chairs, some moaning softly, others silent in their suffering. A child whimpered in her mother's arms, her forehead burning with fever. An elderly man clutched his chest, his breathing labored and wet. They had been waiting for hours, maybe days. Name, the registration clerk didn't look up. Musa Sawadogo. Traoré lied, using his grandfather's name. Age, 68. Payment. He fumbled in his pocket, producing crumpled bills that barely covered the admission fee. The clerk counted them twice, frowning at their worn condition, before stamping his form with the violence of bureaucratic contempt. The shared ward assaulted his senses. 20 beds crammed into a space meant for 10, separated by stained curtains that hung like defeated flags. The mattresses were thin foam pads that had long ago lost their battle against gravity. Bed sheets, where they existed, were threadbare and gray with age. A single fan wheezed overhead, stirring the thick air without cooling it. Traoré was assigned to bed 17, next to a window with a broken pane patched with cardboard. As he lowered himself onto the mattress, springs creaked in rusty protest. The pillow smelled of other people's sweat, and dreams turned to nightmares. His ward mates were a gallery of suffering. To his left, a construction worker with a bandaged leg that seeped yellow fluid. To his right, a teacher whose persistent cough suggested tuberculosis. Across the aisle, a farmer whose jaundiced skin spoke of liver failure. They were his people, and he had failed them. Night brought its own revelations. Nurses appeared irregularly, their white uniforms dingy under the stuttering lights. When patients called for help, for water, for pain relief, the responses were predictable. Wait. Later. Do you have family to bring supplies? Around 3 in the morning, a nurse approached his bed. She was young, perhaps 25, with tired eyes that had seen too much. She stared at him longer than necessary, her brow furrowed in concentration. Traoré's heart hammered against his ribs. Had she recognized him despite his disguise? "You remind me of someone," she said softly. He held his breath, preparing excuses, ready to abort the mission. "My uncle," she continued, her voice heavy with memory. "He died here last year. Same bed, actually. Couldn't afford the antibiotics." She shook her head and moved on, leaving Traoré alone with the weight of her words. As dawn approached, painting the sky the color of old blood, Traoré lay awake, his body aching from the inadequate mattress, his soul aching from what he had witnessed. From the corridor came the sound of crying, high, desperate, the sound of a parent facing the unthinkable. "Please," a woman's voice begged. "She's only 6 years old. The fever won't break." "I told you," came the cold response of authority. "No payment, no treatment. This isn't charity." The crying intensified, then faded as footsteps retreated down the hall. Traoré clenched his fists beneath the thin sheet, his nails digging crescents into his palms. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more evidence of the cancer eating his healthcare system. But tonight, in this moment, he was just another forgotten man in a forgotten bed, listening to the sound of his country's heart breaking. The screams from the surgery room pierced through the hospital walls like rusted nails through flesh. "Please," a man's voice broke between sobs. "The anesthesia. You said there was no more, but I saw the bottles." The surgical staff continued their work, their silence more damning than any confession. In his narrow bed, Ibrahim Traoré pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound seeped through, joining the symphony of suffering that had become his world. 3 days had passed since his arrival at St. Catherine Provincial Hospital. 3 days that felt like 3 years. Each hour revealed new layers of cruelty masked as medical care. Traoré had filled his mental notebook with observations that made his stomach churn and his heart rage against its cage of ribs. He watched nurses walk past dying patients to tend to those who slipped money under their pillows. He saw doctors arrive in luxury cars, stay for minutes, then disappear to private clinics where the wealthy waited. He witnessed medicines meant for the poor vanish through back doors in the dark hours before dawn. The morning of his 3rd day brought a scene that would haunt him forever. An elderly man in bed 12, a retired schoolteacher named Joseph Ouedraogo, had been wheezing through the night. His lungs were failing, drowning in fluid that antibiotics could clear, if only they were available. The man's daughter, herself barely able to afford bus fare, had scraped together enough for 1 dose. She counted out wrinkled bills with shaking hands, only to be told the price had doubled overnight. "But yesterday you said," she began. "Prices change." The pharmacist shrugged. Supply and demand. Traoré watched the old teacher's chest rise and fall in increasingly desperate rhythms. By noon, the breathing stopped altogether. His daughter's wail cut through the ward like a blade. She collapsed beside the bed, her fingers clutching her father's still warm hand, her tears falling on sheets that hadn't been changed in days. The nurse who came to record the death barely paused in her documentation. Another statistic, Another empty bed to fill. That night, unable to sleep, Traoré dragged himself to the bathroom. The facility was a monument to neglect. Broken tiles, backed-up toilets, a sink that dripped brown water. As he steadied himself against the wall, he heard voices from the supply closet next door. The thin partition couldn't muffle what was being discussed. "Shipment comes Thursday," someone said. "Same as always, half to the private clinics, half to the pharmacy here. But the inventory will show what it needs to show. The director has it handled." The pieces clicked together in Traoré's mind, like bullets sliding into a chamber. The mysterious shortages, the doubled prices, the medicines that were perpetually out of stock. It was all orchestrated, a symphony of greed conducted by those sworn to heal. He shuffled back to his bed, his disguise weighing heavier than before. Around him, his fellow patients slept fitfully or stared at the ceiling, each lost in their private pain. The construction worker's infected leg had worsened. The smell of gangrene was beginning to seep through his bandages. The teacher's tuberculosis cough had developed a wet, rattling quality that spoke of lungs surrendering to disease. The farmer's yellow skin had deepened to bronze, his belly swollen with fluid his failing liver couldn't process. On the fourth morning, a commotion erupted at the ward entrance. A woman burst through the doors, her face wild with panic, carrying a small boy whose lips had turned the color of winter sky. "Malaria," she gasped to anyone who would listen. "He's had fever for 3 days. Please, someone help." The charge nurse approached with the measured steps of someone who had performed this dance too many times. "Do you have insurance money for treatment?" "I have this." The mother thrust forward a handful of bills that wouldn't buy a decent meal in the capital. "It's all I have. Please, look at him." The boy's breathing was shallow, his small chest barely moving. His eyes had rolled back, showing crescents of white. Any medical student could see he was sliding toward cerebral malaria, toward seizures and coma and death. The treatment existed. Artemisinin compounds sitting in the very pharmacy that had denied the old teacher his antibiotics. "I'm sorry," the nurse said, her voice professionally empty. "Without proper payment, we cannot admit him. Try the government clinic on Avenue Kennedy. They might have a payment plan." "But that's 6 miles away," the mother cried. "He won't make it." "Then I suggest you hurry." The nurse turned away, her white shoes clicking against the floor with metronomic indifference. The mother stood frozen, her child limp in her arms, her face a map of desperation. Others in the ward looked away, their own powerlessness too familiar to bear witnessing again. Something inside Traoré snapped, not broke, snapped, like a wire pulled too tight, like a bone under pressure, like the last thread holding back a flood. He couldn't watch another child die. He couldn't let another mother join the ranks of the bereaved. Not when he had the power to stop it. He pushed himself up from his bed, his disguise suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. His hand shook as he reached for the small phone hidden in his belongings, the one emergency link to his real identity. His ward mates were too absorbed in their own suffering to notice as he limped to the corner furthest from the nurse's station. The young janitor, the one who had unknowingly revealed the corruption scheme, was mopping nearby. He glanced at Traoré with mild curiosity as the supposed old man fumbled with what looked like an outdated phone. But something in Traoré's posture had changed. The bent spine was straightening, the shuffling gait was firming, the clouded eyes were clearing with a fury that seemed to burn through his disguise. Traoré turned his back to the ward and dialed a number known only to his most trusted security chief. When the voice answered, he spoke in a whisper that carried the weight of mountains moving. "This is Eagle 1. He used his classified identifier. "Priority Alpha. I need the emergency response team at St. Catherine Provincial Hospital. Full tactical unit, medical corps, and documentary crew. Seal all exits. No one leaves, sir." The voice on the other end was startled. "Confirmation code. Thunder brings the rain." Traoré gave the phrase that confirmed his identity beyond doubt. "Move now. Lives are at stake." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his ragged pants. The mother was still standing in the doorway, her child's breathing growing more labored with each second. The nurse had returned to her station, filing paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency. The other patients continued their silent suffering, but outside, beyond the hospital's stained walls, something was changing. The night air carried the distant rumble of engines starting, of orders being barked, of justice preparing to arrive with the dawn. Traoré returned to his bed and lay down, his heart pounding with anticipation and rage. 20 minutes. That's how long his people had to live with this cruelty. 20 minutes before the walls came down, before the truth emerged from shadows, before those who had turned healing into commerce faced the consequences of their choices. He closed his eyes and counted the seconds, each one a prayer for the dying boy, for all the Joseph Ouedraogos who had breathed their last in these walls, for every mother who had walked away with empty arms and broken hearts. The revolution wouldn't come with speeches or policies. It would arrive with sirens in the night, with doors kicked open, with the bright light of accountability flooding every dark corner where greed had festered. 20 minutes. Traoré pulled his thin sheet up to his chin and waited for his country to change. The convoy hit St. Catherine Provincial Hospital like a thunderclap at dawn. Military vehicles roared through the gates, their headlights slicing through the morning mist like swords of justice. Behind them came police cruisers, ambulances, and news vans with satellite dishes already extending toward the sky. The hospital's security guard dropped his phone, his face draining of color as he recognized the presidential seal on the lead vehicle. The revolution had arrived not with whispers, but with the roar of engines and the flash of cameras documenting everything. Inside the hospital, chaos erupted like a disturbed anthill. Nurses ran in confusion, their white uniforms fluttering like surrender flags. Doctors who hadn't been seen for days suddenly materialized from their offices, straightening their coats and trying to appear professional. The pharmacy staff frantically attempted to hide evidence, shoving papers into trash bins and deleting computer files with trembling fingers. But it was too late. The net had already closed. Dr. Marcel Compaoré, the hospital director, burst from his office with the wild eyes of a cornered animal. His Italian leather shoes, worth more than most patients' monthly income, slipped on the polished floor as he rushed toward the main entrance. His silk tie, imported from Paris, hung askew. The gold watch on his wrist caught the emergency lights, a glinting reminder of where the hospital's budget had really gone. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted at the approaching officers, trying to summon authority he no longer possessed. "This is a medical facility. You can't just—" His words died as General Caboret, head of the president's security detail, stepped forward. "By order of the president of Burkina Faso, this facility is under immediate investigation. No one leaves. Everyone will be questioned." Audit teams swarmed through the building like antibodies attacking an infection. They broke open locked pharmacy cabinets, revealing stockpiles of medications marked as out of stock in the system. They found receipts for sales to private clinics, bank transfers to offshore accounts, and logs showing that life-saving drugs had been diverted while patients died in the wards. Every discovery was photographed, filmed, catalogued, evidence of systematic betrayal that had cost countless lives. In the shared ward, patients pressed against windows and doorways, drawn by the commotion despite their ailments. The construction worker hobbled forward on his infected leg. The teacher wrapped his blanket tighter around his tubercular frame. The jaundiced farmer propped himself against a wall. They had lived through too much disappointment to believe in sudden justice. Yet something in the morning air felt different, charged with possibility. Then came the moment that would be replayed on every television in Burkina Faso for weeks to come. From bed 17. The hunched old man with a wooden cane began to rise, but his movement was different now. purposeful, powerful. He straightened his spine vertebra by vertebra, each inch revealing more of the leader hidden beneath the rags. He pulled off the tattered cap, revealing hair that was not gray but black. He wiped his face with steady hands, removing the makeup that had aged him 20 years. When he finally stood at his full height, the ward fell silent. "My God," whispered the construction worker. "It's him. It's really him." Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, stood among them not as a distant figurehead but as a fellow sufferer who had shared their beds, breathed their air, felt their pain. His eyes, no longer clouded by disguise, blazed with righteous fury as he walked toward the assembled crowd. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of every injustice he had witnessed. "Doctor," Compaoré's knees buckled. He fell to the ground, his expensive suit grinding into the dust of neglect that coated his hospital's floors. "Your Excellency," he stammered. I didn't know. I can explain." Traoré's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the gathering crowd. "I came here as Musa Sawadogo, a poor man with stomach pain. I slept in your beds that haven't been cleaned in weeks. I ate your food that wouldn't be fit for prisoners. I watched your nurses demand bribes while children suffered. I saw you, Dr. Compaoré, loading medicines into private vehicles while telling dying patients there was nothing available." He paused, letting each word sink like a stone into still water. "You took an oath to heal. Instead, you built an empire of suffering on the backs of the poor. You turned this place of healing into a marketplace of death. The cameras captured everything, the president's controlled fury, the director's collapse, the tears streaming down the faces of patients who finally felt seen." Then Traoré turned to someone unexpected, the young janitor who had unknowingly revealed the corruption. "You, sir," Traoré called out. "Please, come forward." The janitor, barely 20 years old, approached with shaking legs. "Your Excellency, I'm just a cleaner." "No," Traoré said firmly. "You are a truth-teller. You are what this hospital needs. Someone who sees injustice and names it, even when you think no one is listening. From today, you will serve on the Citizens' Healthcare Oversight Committee. Your voice, and voices like yours, will ensure this never happens again." Within hours, the arrests began. Dr. Compaoré was led away in handcuffs, followed by the head pharmacist, the chief financial officer, and 6 others. The news footage showed them covering their faces, their designer clothes now badges of shame. But more important than the arrests were the arrivals. New doctors, honest ones, flown in from the capital. Fresh supplies of medicines, distributed free to every patient. Real food, clean sheets, and most precious of all, dignity returning to the halls. The mother with the malaria-stricken child was found at the government clinic 6 miles away, her son barely conscious. A medical helicopter, the president's own, flew them back to St. Catherine's, where a team of pediatric specialists was already waiting. The boy received the artemisinin treatment that had sat locked in the pharmacy while profit calculations were made with his life. Within hours, his fever broke. Within days, he was sitting up, eating, smiling. His recovery became a symbol of what was possible when healthcare served humanity instead of greed. President Traoré addressed the nation that evening, standing in the same ward where he had spent 4 nights as a forgotten patient. "Today, we begin the National Health Justice Initiative," he announced. "No citizen of Burkina Faso will be denied care because of poverty. No doctor will profit from suffering. No medicine will be locked away while children die. This is not just policy, it is a sacred promise." The reforms were swift and comprehensive. Every hospital in the country underwent surprise audits. Citizen oversight committees were established, staffed by ordinary people who understood the true cost of medical neglect. Medicines were tracked from importation to patient, with blockchain technology preventing diversion. Healthcare workers' salaries were increased. but with new accountability measures that made corruption a crime punishable by decades in prison. 6 months later, a mural appeared on the front wall of St. Catherine Provincial Hospital, painted by local artists and patients who had survived the old regime. It showed a figure rising from a hospital bed, starting hunched and ragged, then standing tall and strong. Behind the figure, a stethoscope curved into the shape of Burkina Faso. At the base, in letters 3 feet high, were words that would come to define Traoré's presidency. Leadership is not above pain. It walks through it. The hospital itself was transformed. The emergency room that had turned away the dying now operated 24 hours a day, free to all. The pharmacy that had hoarded medicines now displayed its stock publicly, with prices that even the poorest could afford. The wards that had reeked of neglect now smelled of disinfectant and hope. Nurses who had once demanded bribes now competed for compassion awards given by patient committees. Doctors who had disappeared to private clinics now worked full shifts, their luxury cars replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The young janitor, promoted to the oversight committee, instituted a simple but powerful tradition. Every month, committee members would spend a night as patients, experiencing the hospital from the inside. They would eat the food, use the facilities, interact with staff who didn't know their true identities. It became known as walking through the pain, a reminder that true reform required constant vigilance and empathy. Years later, when international health organizations studied Burkina Faso's transformation, they found something that couldn't be graphed or charted, a fundamental shift in how a nation viewed healthcare. It was no longer seen as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as a human right to be protected and cherished. The infant mortality rate plummeted, life expectancy soared. But more than statistics, what changed was belief. The belief that a government could truly serve its people, that leaders could choose sacrifice over comfort, that justice delayed was not always justice denied. President Traoré never forgot those 4 nights in bed 17. In his office, he kept a small reminder, a splinter from the wooden cane he had carried, mounted in a simple frame. Visitors often asked about it, and he would tell them, "It reminds me that leadership isn't about standing above the people. It's about walking among them, feeling their pain, and having the courage to transform that pain into purpose." The story of St. Catherine's became legend. Told in schools and homes across Africa, it proved that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with armies or manifestos, but with a leader willing to become vulnerable, to truly see and be seen. It showed that justice, when it finally arrives, can heal wounds that seemed permanently infected. Most importantly, it demonstrated that real change happens when those in power remember a simple truth: every citizen deserves dignity, every life has value, and every leader must be willing to walk through pain to find the path to healing. In the end, the transformation of Burkina Faso's healthcare system stood as a testament to the power of empathy and leadership. It reminded the world that true strength isn't measured in the distance between the ruler and the ruled, but in the willingness to close that gap entirely. Sometimes, to lift a nation up, a leader must first be willing to lie down among the suffering and see the world through their eyes. Only then can real change begin, not from the top down, but from the ground up, one healed heart at a time. Thanks for following Ibrahim Traoré's inspiring journey. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch more amazing stories from Vibe Yard.